music serves as a universal language that connects people on a profound, intangible level. But how do musicians do this? I'm Warren Buchholz, Jazz Brand Manager at WUSF, and I'm on a mission to find out. Meet Andrew Berish. He is an associate professor in the Department of Humanities and Cultural Studies at the University of South Florida. He has a Ph.D. in musicology and is the author of Hating Jazz, a history of its disparagement, mockery, and other forms of abuse. He sat down with me in the WUSF studio to talk more about his book. I hope you enjoy. Well, thank you, Andrew, for taking some time to meet with me about your new book, Hating Jazz. First, can you tell me more about your role here at USF?
Sure. I'm an associate professor in the Humanities and Cultural Studies Department. I've been at USF for about 20 years. And our department, we teach social life and history through art. And we're kind of multidisciplinary department. So there's, I'm a musicologist. We have other musicologists, American studies, historians, and growing film studies department as well.
And you're a musician, is that correct?
I am, well, I've played jazz since I was in high school. I was as a drummer and then more recently as a guitarist. But I realized that my great skill, I was more of a library person and was more comfortable in the stacks. And so even though I did play drums in college, in college bands and both jazz and other genres, I decided I would pursue history and ultimately did musicology, which is music history. I still play, and I do occasionally go to jam sessions around town, but I'm a much better scholar.
How do you feel that being a musician or playing music has kind of enhanced or helped your educational background?
Oh, yeah, it's been a kind of parallel development. So I've always kept the music going because that was always really important to me to understand. I mean, what drew me to jazz history was just trying to understand the music, like how it was put together, how does it work, even at a very technical level. Is it a minor flat five or a Dorian scale? Like just the kind of technical stuff really interested me, and so that I always, and it's a bit of the kind of scholarly world I came out of where you're always trying to balance the two, that it's musical specificity with historical and social context.
So Hating Jazz, you go really, really in depth on why people hate jazz, and hating music does feel cyclical in that respect of, it seems like every time a new genre pops up, there's hate. So like the jazz, disco, hip hop, rap, even boy bands you go into. Why do we hate so much?
There's lots of theories. I think loving something intensely is often paired with hating things. And that's something psychologists, Freud, thought about and other philosophers have thought about for a long, long time. Often if you are deeply invested in things, and where that investment comes from is complicated. It's both the sounds and who you are and where you are in life and time and place. But that investment often has a flip side. So you want to protect things that you love from anything that diminishes it or demeans it. So that's one source. And that's mostly and later chapters of the book kind of focus on kind of critique from inside the jazz community, why there's been so much contempt, surprising amount of contempt.
Very surprising.
Other jazz musicians toward other jazz musicians. But there's a kind of hatred or contempt that comes from outside the jazz world. And those have been kind of focused on certain themes over and over again. For instance, attacking music because you feel it was produced for the marketplace, that it was, the idea of selling out, or that it's not art with a capital A, it's art for the dollar. There are people often hate music for the purported effects it causes. So early jazz is a good example, and this extends to all kinds of genres, and even later to rock and roll, and then to hip hop. That the music, the specificities of the music make people do bad things, that it's morally, poisoning. And finally, people hate things, I think, when they feel like it violates certain standards of the craft, whatever that might be. And that, of course, varies. So if you love classical trumpet and then you hear a jazz player playing slurring notes and playing half valving and things like that, which is not as much a part of classical practice, then you could despise it for its, disavowal of certain standards. So I think there are some commonalities amongst why we hate. I think it does come from a love of the thing you love and anything that sort of threatens it.
You do have a great quote in the book. We seem conceited to turn the best things in life into sources of bitterness. That is powerful, I will say. That's a powerful quote.
That was, I think that's Hazlitt.
Yeah, Hazlitt.
William Hazlitt was a 18th century critic, writer, not as well known today, but wrote a really famous essay about hating. And he makes the argument that it's just kind of foundational to human nature, that it's like as much as we love, we hate. And I think some people have read it more positively, that hating has some social value. And there's a larger argument that it kind of builds community, and it can be a kind of force for unifying people around things that are bad. But I think in the end, Hazlitt kind of says, like, look, this is a part of human nature. We need to wrestle with it, but it's not a great thing because it kind of curdles, it curdles things. And and the essay is great because, and I put it in the book, even though it's like he's an 18th century British critic of literature and theater and other things. But I thought it was great because it shows how things things you love can kind of lose their impact and can kind of sour on you. And that, he's just a really interesting thinker about this, and sort of posits that it's just a part of our life. Like, it's really not why do we hate stuff? Well, that's why do we love stuff?
How did you go about finding all this research? What was your process for all that?
Yeah. So it all kind of started after I watched Damien Chazelle's La La Land, which was ages ago in 2016. And it was a great moment for jazz because it kind of featured the music very prominently. Mm-hmm. And there was a kind of flurry of reactions, critics and musicians, everyone had an opinion.
Ryan Gosling saves jazz.
Gosling saves jazz, exactly. Right. Yeah, Seb's, he wants a jazz club. I mean, there's a lot of things about it that are kind of amusing. But the Damien Chazelle played jazz, and he kind of really, there's things about it that he really understood. And there's a kind of famous scene in there where Mia, played by Emma Stone, says in their budding relationship with Ryan Gosling, who's Seb, and she's like, before we go on, I need to tell you something. I hate jazz. And it's this great moment. And he's like, what do you mean you hate jazz? What does that mean? And then she says, and what she describes is like she hates, I guess, smooth jazz or Kenny G or something like that. She doesn't specify, but that's generally. And then he kind of drags her to a jazz club in the middle of the day, which is also kind of great. A bit of fantasy, I think. And the reaction to the movie was very intense. And it was, what is this? And do people really hate jazz? And that was the kind of starting point. That got me thinking, all right, I think I can build a book about this. And it was connected to kind of two other things. One is an ongoing interest of mine in kind of the mystery of taste and judgment. Why do we love certain things and hate certain things? And who tells us and where does it come from? And there's a kind of myth that when you hear something great, you just know it and it's great. And I just never felt that way. because I kind of learned about jazz. I had a great high school teacher, and we were making mixtapes of things, and I was listening to it, but also learning how the music works, and how you navigate the chord changes and how you establish a sense of swing and groove. And I was like, oh, like I learned to like this music, and that doesn't demean it in any way. That's just sort of how it works, and I think that goes for any genre, really.
Yeah.
And so the mystery of taste, the kind of hullabaloo around La La Land were kind of two of the motivating factors for the book.
You did, again, really in-depth research with the book. Is there anything that really stood out to you? Something that maybe surprised you when you were going through all the research?
Yeah. The part of the book that was the most fun was the satirical attacks on jazz, which, there are kind of two things that surprised me. One, that even though people say it's a common refrain and you see it in the media that they hate jazz, the more I thought about it and the more I researched, it's like, I don't think people really hate it. It just doesn't have the kind of emotional pull or emotional draw that other genres have. And that if these surveys, some are serious, some are not, but it's pretty clear that people hate Justin Bieber way more. I mean, that's an old reference now. I mean, put your current pop star in there. They hate whatever. A Taylor Swift would be more polarizing a figure than, I don't know, any current jazz musician today. So that surprised me that jazz, it doesn't really have a strong affect either way. And that means it kind of floats around our culture. And that was interesting to me. The second was in the satire chapter, where when you're looking at people making fun of jazz, it was really striking how it really seemed to emanate from the white world, like not the Black community itself or Black musicians. There's critique within the Black community of approaches to jazz and things like that, but the satire just seemed overwhelmingly white. And that surprised me, and that seemed really interesting and worth something to explain. And ultimately, I think, jazz has always been, from the very beginning, a way that kind of, in this world that America created, where there's a kind of binary, a kind of color line between white and Black, jazz was one of these ways that people kind of spoke to that color line, to either understand across it or to critique it, or, in some way, you're engaging with Black culture and Black life in some way. And that's ultimately how I think I try to explain it. It's a kind of fascination. And there's an ambiguity in a lot of the humor around jazz. And that also I found really interesting. It's a kind of a mixture of love and hate, or a sort of fascination and sometimes disgust. And the target of it is unclear. So sometimes when people are making fun of jazz, they're making fun of, in a more direct way, elements of Black fashion or culture or behavior or style, especially like linguistic things, their jazz terminology of, I don't know, hipster language and all that kind of stuff. But then sometimes I think the target is whites who are aping that culture. And jazz has always been, because it has been this way to engage with Black culture, there's also a sense of whites kind of trying things on. And I think some of these satirical attacks are kind of directed at that, to kind of unmask that as something that should be thought about or pulled back. So those are kind of two things that really surprised me.
You referenced that Simpsons visual gag, a 1 hour show, 2 songs played, stuff like that.
The satire chapter was the most fun thing to write. And I had so many examples, and then I just keep finding stuff. It's just so rich. The Simpsons I always liked because it seemed kind of playful. And I make a distinction between things that are sort of playful, like that Simpsons episode is great. It's where Bart learns to play the drums, and I looked it up, and Matt Groening was a jazz fan, and
gotcha.
So, but then there's humor that's more what I call tendentious, and that's a kind of Freudian term, and it's that there's a hostility there. Sometimes it's more on the surface and sometimes it's more buried. And for instance, one thing that kind of anchored this part of the book for me was that the episode of The Office
with
Dwight and Angela, and it's just a throwaway line, has nothing to do. The episode's about something else. And he's trying to console Angela, Dwight is, and he says, "You're not stupid, jazz is stupid." And then she says, and that's funny. And then she says, "Yes, just play the right notes."
Yeah.
And it's a very funny joke, and it does make me laugh. But then there's something kind of sour about it, because it's the biggest insult, like something stupid, that it's sort of beneath your respect.
It punches down.
It punches down a little bit. And but I think in a lot of jazz satire, there's a feeling that you're punching up, because there's a sense that jazz is undeserving of its accolades, that it's in a perverse way. I mean, jazz has achieved a kind of cultural status, but it's been a struggle. And I think people forget that I mean, just even writing a book about jazz for an academic press would have been unthinkable, when jazz emerged, and maybe even through the 30s and 40s. I mean, they're rare, and now it's a much more common thing. And that battle for respect, in some ways, has achieved stuff. You have jazz at Lincoln Center and SF Jazz and things like that. But so there's a perception, I think, that jazz has achieved this cultural status, and that deserves a knocking down. No one listens to this music. no one really understands it.
Yeah.
There's a great Fred Armisen skit. I saw it online. I saw him live, and he does a similar thing with classical music. So he's an equal opportunity offender. And it's funny. And he's like, everyone says they like jazz, or you say you like jazz, but you really don't. And I'm going to show you. And then he plays a recording, and it's some very kind of more avant-garde kind of piece. And then he's like, "I'm going to play this piece, and you're going to raise your hand when you're bored, and when it loses you." And then the gag is like, he plays it, and then like 2 seconds in, he raises his hand, And so I think a lot of this humor is like, they think they're punching up. And I thought it was worth kind of explaining that, and not kind of condemning it. I think it's wrong, but it doesn't understand the history. But I think the people think they are punching up.
What stood out to me, and I want to kind of stay on the racial lines, those boundaries of it seems like the affect of hating jazz or disliking jazz, it becomes a racial one at the very bottom of it all. Can you talk more about how you came up with that kind of thesis?
Yeah, and it's worth emphasizing that it's not something kind of grafted on. It's like, if you go back and you read the reception of jazz, because in some ways what I've done is, it's a tradition of scholarly writing where it's like a reception history. So you take an art object of some kind, you explain how people understood it and reacted with it, interacted with it. So when you're doing that kind of thing, and you're kind of looking back at all the different ways people have responded to this music as the music has changed and developed and altered, and people have argued about it, the one single thing you notice is that every writer from the very beginning, from when it first emerges in the late 19 teens through the present, it has always been a way to engage with African American life. And you see that it's just in the writing, and from the very beginning, and trying to understand where the music came from, like, where do these syncopations come from, and where do these interesting notes and blues notes and things that are kind of in between the notes that we know, and you get all that stuff from the late 19 teens and 20s, 30s. Every decade is wrestling with that, and it was only kind of later when scholars really started looking in. There's like, look, this, and within the Black community, it's always understood that this music is part of a continuum of Black music that extends back to when Africans are brought to the New World as slaves. They bring with them their culture in their heads, and they kind of recreate and synthesize new forms of music making, field hollers, work songs, and you have spirituals. And that works its way in other ways into American culture through blackface minstrelsy. And then you get things like ragtime. So jazz is part of that continuum. And it was long understood by its early practitioners and those in New Orleans that there is this kind of history. And it's a complex history of fusions and mixtures. But at root, the things that define it, I think, are the things that are rooted in Afro-diasporic practices. A certain approach to musical things and certain values. So approach to rhythm and an approach to syncopation and rhythm and groove, an approach to interesting and unusual ways of sound production. And people debate this. And the scholarly consensus is pretty clear to me that it's a complicated story, but ultimately it's rooted in these Black practices. And that was the sort of foundation. And like I said, it's just everywhere over. It's just looking at jazz history. That's what it's about. And it seemed an important argument to make right now as well. And that kind of ties everything together in a way, because loving or hating jazz is always in some way some engagement with this complicated, seemingly intractable element of American life, of this kind of racial divide. And how we navigate it and how we, make our lives better and how we come together and understand each other. So, yeah, it's really foundational.
There's a good quote you have in the book. A judgment of taste is not hate in its strongest form, for it does not usually argue for annihilation. Good music can replace and correct for bad.
Oh, yeah. I kind of I decided when I was kind of trying to organize the book, I ended up kind of breaking into 3 units. And so I focused on taste first. And that's the kind of world of kind of one of the things that's always interested me. How do we decide what's good or bad, and who decides, and what role does who we are play in that? And that quote comes from that section. The other sections were satire, and then the third is the internal critique, which is really about genre, about kind of defending or policing boundaries and who gets to decide what is jazz and what is not, kind of from within the jazz community. But this first quote, what I'm trying to say there is that in this world of taste, it's not hate kind of in the strongest sense. And when I was building the book, using the word hate was really key, because that word it's a complicated word, right? Because on the one hand, it describes all the things that are terrible in the world, racism, misogyny, xenophobia.
I didn't even think of homophobia either.
Homophobia, right. Like all these things are variants of hate. And hate is this kind of very intense emotion, and it seems to be a pathway to violence and really, terrible things. On the other hand, we hate sweaters, and then hating a jazz record or a jazz artist seems kind of it's sort of somewhere between the two, and so it seemed to be more of a continuum, right? So to say you hate jazz in the context of taste, it really didn't seem the strongest form. It didn't seem, we're not talking Nazism or something. It seemed something else. And that's what I was trying to get at, that a lot of the critiques of jazz, well, they partake of misogyny, particularly racism early on. They really are driven by a need that, like, this is bad, so we're just going to, don't listen to this. Listen to this. This is better, and this will improve you. Kind of an old sense of culture improving you. And that's where that idea comes from, and fits into the book.
We got to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Hey, I hope you're enjoying this and all the quality content we offer through WUSF. We need your help, though. Like everything in an overcapitalized society, things cost money to operate, like creating all of the awesome videos and podcasts you see here. Now, I could break out the puppies and play to Sarah McLachlan, and you break down and hit donate, but I think we're bigger people here. So, if you're able and willing, please donate your dollars today by visiting wusf.org/donate to get started. Anything helps, and your money goes toward producing all of this content, supporting our community, and a whole lot more. And if enough people do this, maybe these annoying ads will go away. Puppies! Donate today. I'd love to take a moment for you to maybe read a passage if you have something prepared.
Sure. Yeah. Hating jazz is about a lot of things, but first it is about evaluation and judgment. I listen, contemplate, and then decide if it is good or bad, art or trash. Either I keep that to myself or I speak or write about that judgment. As Simon Frith has pointed out in regard to rock and pop, evaluation and judgment represent fundamental ways we engage with popular music. It connects us to communities of listeners who share our evaluations. It can also mark out difference, separating lovers and haters. Labeling some music as bad, Frith writes, is, quote, a way we establish our place in various musical worlds. Not to like a record, he continues, is not just a matter of taste, it is also a matter of argument, an argument that matters. The focus of my study is the public expression of that negative evaluation of jazz. Why and when do people communicate their dislike? What is at stake? What historical conditions trigger and frame such public expressions of hate? I should be clear at the beginning that I love jazz. I've played it and studied it for many years as a drummer and more recently as a guitarist. Jazz in its many varieties continues to be an integral part of my life as a scholar and fan. Although my instrumental study and listening preferences reside in the, quote, mainstream of the music, the mostly acoustic, small group, post-bop improvisational style, I listen widely and I hope with an open mind to all kinds of jazz, including Latin jazz, European-based free jazz, and smooth jazz. Even as I have tried to cultivate broad listening habits, I often fall back on evaluative language when describing my listening to other people. This music is good, innovative, creative, or new. That music is bad, boring, uninteresting, or cliched. I am also implicated in the same racial dynamics that have defined jazz since its emergence. As a white musician and a scholar, I came at the music through the black mirror. Jazz musical culture in its virtuosities and grooves offered something powerful to me, an effective, emotional experience that was compelling and not otherwise available. It also opened a door into a larger, deeper black aesthetic. The historical account of jazz hating that follows is inevitably shaped by my own experiences and, like all histories, is partial and incomplete. But reflecting on my own tendencies has helped me to understand the ways race, affect, and evaluative language intertwine in jazz discourse, both academic and journalistic.
Can you talk more about how you came up with this paragraph? What kind of inspired that?
Yeah, so I wanted to explain. So one thing, when you tell people you're writing a book about hating jazz, and this goes for my mom and like whoever else I talk to, they'd be like, well, why do I hate it? Mm-hmm. And of course, like, look, if I put on Louis Armstrong or, more to the point, like music with lyrics like Ella Fitzgerald singing Rodgers and Hart or something, I'm sure most people would say, my mom would say, I love that. That's not jazz, but, well, that's my point, Yeah. And so I wanted to kind of emphasize that the book is not diagnostic, right? So, which is too bad because that would be a much better way to sell books, but it's historical. So it's kind of explaining these negative receptions of jazz historically, and that they have certain historical things have happened for certain historical reasons. And what seemed important was, and the thing you can really write about is like, I can't get inside people's heads, but what I can do is trace when they felt strong enough to say it out loud in interviews or in particular writing, because as historians, we're often dealing with writing.
You had the Reddit threads that you went through and stuff like that.
Yeah, like the Reddit threads. Because I did want to capture some of the kind of general ways people critique jazz today, or when they say they don't like it. And so, yes, I would look at things like Reddit threads, and they just seemed very typical. They would say, these are very common complaints you see today. This is more recent stuff, yep. But they echo through the years. So, for instance, jazz is not melodic, which is interesting because it's really nothing but melody, just long, complex melodies or short, simple melodies. But that has been so consistent that there are jazz books from the 40s and 50s about, to kind of teach people to listen that are, where's the melody? And then even a more recent kind of jazz guide is like, where's the melody? So that's a common critique. Other critiques is that it's chaotic. Everyone's playing different songs at once. You hear that a lot. It's boring, or it's not danceable, which is interesting. That it's serious, that it's like eating spinach. This goes back to the idea that culture is good for you, that it tastes bad, but it's good for you. A lot of critique of improvisation, that it's aimless, it's self-indulgent, it's endless. And that all these are interesting for different ways. And then this is also one that's been historically consistent, is rhythm. That it's chaotic, it's unclear, it's hard to follow. That has changed, but the attacks on jazz have often focused on rhythm. And this is very closely tied to Black musical practices, particularly notions of syncopation, polyrhythm, and groove, the sense of a rhythm that kind of feels so good that it wants to make you dance or move your body, and you want it to kind of keep going. And so much of American popular music is groove-based and rooted in this aesthetic. And that has been a source of fear and angst, and it partakes of all those critiques I said, that especially the effects that danceable music can lead to sexual impropriety, racial mixing, and that's something that was a concern with jazz, but then of course with rock and roll, and arguably with hip hop as well. Yeah, I think what was interesting was, you start the book and you're like, what's it like now? What's the current, kind of temperature for jazz, and what are people complaining about? And then what's interesting is kind of tracing those ideas out historically, and that there's certain things are consistent, certain things are not. A lot of it depends with these Reddits, like you don't even know what they're talking about, right? Is it John Coltrane? Is it Louis Armstrong? Is it Ella Fitzgerald? Is it Dave Brubeck? I mean, you just have no idea. So it seemed useful to take these ideas that are often kind of vague and kind of flesh them out, both today, what people mean by that, and what they meant in the past.
It is interesting. You have that chart in the book about how popular music is and how it's declined. And it was really interesting to see that jazz hasn't really changed over the years. It's kind of stayed the same. There it is.
Yeah. You asked about things that surprised me, and that totally surprised me. So if you start looking at polling, and there's been several polls since the 90s, some of much larger. This one is a music preference in the U.S. This was a National Endowment for the Arts one from 2005. It was a big one, used big data set. And yes, jazz is like right smack in the middle. Like its popularity has neither increased nor declined. It's just kind of been the same over a certain period of time when they were doing the study. That surprised me because, if you live in the kind of jazz world and the jazz community, it's just it has always felt kind of dire, especially the streaming world, which has affected everyone, has been very difficult for jazz musicians. And then there's a critical response of jazz is dying, and this kind of common theme that you hear. And then you look at it and you're like, actually, the problem isn't that people hate it. It's that they don't kind of gravitate. It doesn't seem to grip them in some way. And that the one thing I kind of ultimately had to address, but was a little reluctant, was, the question of like, where does jazz go today? Or, how do we make people love it today?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's an obvious question. I felt like I had to say something about it, right? Because then people feel like I'm just avoiding it. And I think where I come down is that, look, the people will continue to make this music. People go to jazz schools here at USF and at other places, and people continue to want to do it. People get enamored with the music like I did, like many people did, and it becomes a part of their life, and you want to play it and master it, or try to, and really get better at it, never master it. But at the same time, people will continue to play it, and people will continue to listen to it, and there will be fans, and that's great. And certainly education and things like this and what you do here at USF can help, and that they're really important. But I think it was also worth to kind of step back and say, like, there's just a lot of things out of your control, like out of our control as a community of fans and listeners and people who care about this. And like, for instance, that when big band swing caught the attention, it kind of fell at this moment of the end of the Great Depression, or the middle of the Great Depression, and World War II. And it spoke to a lot of concerns. It was a transformation of popular music that preceded it into something kind of often dynamic and energetic. And it really captured America's interest in psyche. It was a youth phenomenon, like all these things. And that was some of that's just historical accident, and so where does future jazz, there are certainly ways to increase people's kind of emotional engagement with it. You can tie it to social movements. Artists have kind of spoken to Black Lives Matter or other political movements. You can connect it to genres that do have a lot of popular or commercial success, like hip hop and R&B. And a lot of people doing that kind of work: Robert Glasper, Theo Croker, Micaiah McCraven, Lakeisha Benjamin. There's lots and lots of artists doing that kind of thing. There are other ways too.
TV, movies, perhaps.
TVs, movie. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. TVs, movies. Right. I didn't even address that. And now there's a whole kind of internet world of jazz too. Video games. That's
video games. Yeah.
My son's really into that, and it's really great. And they take theme songs from Mario Brothers and do these like amazing jazz arrangements.
Yes,
like they won the 8-bit jazz band.
Console, 8-bit jazz band. And I think there's one called the Consoles, something like that. And yeah, it's just incredible how they just rearrange certain video game songs and turn them into jazz.
Yeah, right, totally. It's really terrific stuff. And so, some of this is kind of out of our control, but it's helpful. And that I don't think that's something to be depressed about. I think you keep plugging away, and the culture kind of ebbs and flows. Like you were saying, it kind of ebbs and flows, and maybe jazz will catch a wave. And
maybe we'll get a jazz club around here again in some time.
Yes, that would that would be great.
How has all of this research affected how you listen to jazz or appreciate jazz?
Oh, that's a really good question. In some ways, the book was a summation of my experiences with jazz over the years. It was like a way to talk about a lot of things that I've thought about or in my own listening over the years. And I guess, I sort of rejuvenated a little my interest. It has me listening maybe a bit wider than we get in our little ruts and listen to things. And it's kind of forced me to kind of survey more broadly what's going on and try to understand that. Because there's so much, there's just so much, there's kind of too much to keep track of. And so many interesting fusions and streams of jazz, from avant-garde stuff to, like I said, mixtures of hip hop and R&B and electronic music and all kinds of interesting stuff. So it's sort of woke me up a little, got me a little out of some ruts, and to listen more broadly and think more broadly about all the different manifestations of jazz as a kind of plural, not as a kind of singular entity, as people responding to a kind of tradition, but in kind of interesting and radical ways.
I think the internet has also been a blessing and a curse. A blessing in that it has allowed us to become more exposed to artists that we may have never known because, they're not tied down to a record label. So it's been able to kind of expose us to these kinds of new genres or the mesh of genres and stuff like that.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I discovered people just through internet, like just through their internet presence, YouTube videos or that kind of thing. And right, it's a double-edged sword. It's the internet is some social media. It's very democratizing in a way, but of course, it came at the expense of the institutions that kind of held up the world. The complex world. A little bit of what I talk about. You had record companies and promoters and journalists and record critics and the musicians themselves. And it was this kind of ecosystem, and it might not have been perfect and it struggled, but that has really been changed and weakened in lots of ways. And on the other hand, you have this great democratization as well. I'm optimistic. I think, I really feel there's just so much, and people are still really drawn to the music and to its aesthetic and what it kind of promises. However people approach the jazz tradition, what it means to them, they're kind of remaking it in ways that I speak to the present. And jazz is not alone. I mean, all kinds of genres are, trying to figure out their place. Music. I speak of genres, but you think of communities of musicians and how do you get heard and how do you say something and be meaningful in today's climate? And it's, the other thing is not to see jazz as unique in this way. It's just a kind of aesthetic, a value, a tradition, and like other musical communities and traditions as well, kind of struggling to make sense of this digitalized, algorithm-driven kind of world,
I want to leave us with this quote that you have in the book. Jazz is not just a collection of sounds, but a way of living in the world. That's profound.
That really is. I totally agree. And I think that's what has always attracted jazz musicians. If you read the stories of how people get interested in jazz, there's a lot of accounts of particularly white musicians who encountered, whether it's Benny Goodman or Max Kaminsky, or these early musicians who hear in Chicago in the 1920s, or later musicians. And there's this moment of, it's an aesthetic moment where they kind of hear something that's beautiful, but it's always more than that. It's always kind of the door cracks open and you see other ways of kind of living in the world, of who you are and how you live and move and talk and all these things. And I think that has remained pretty consistent. I mean, you find that again and again with musicians that right. It's of course that's a larger argument of the book, that when we love and hate jazz, it's much more than about the sounds. It's always the sounds in a context, in a certain place and time, and that's I think that's important to recognize. Sometimes there's a kind of mythos around music appreciation that, like, if you just understand the sounds, if you just can understand the form and what Charlie Parker is doing here on these changes, that's all there is, and it's never that. Yep. And the great critics, whether they're black or white or whatever, have always kind of addressed this. Have always said, look, it's a kind of way of being in the world. The music has certain values, certain properties, and those properties extend beyond the music.
Where can people find the book?
You can go to the University of Chicago Press website and order it there. You can order it directly. You can get it on Amazon. It's probably not in your local bookstore, which is a shame, but that's how things go.
It is, you can pre-order through Tombelow.
Oh, Tombelow Books.
Tombelow Books.
Excellent idea. Yes. Go through Tombelow.
Yeah,
I like that.
They're a great little local bookstore.
They really are.
Sure. What is next for you? Is there a sequel? What are you working on now?
Yeah. I don't know. Loving jazz. I thought there are already a lot of books about that. So I did have a project of kind of rethinking pop music in the 40s in terms of ballads. Because when we talk about swing, we tend to think of up-tempo swing dancing, particularly kind of in the popular culture as it kind of got revived in the 90s and early 2000s. But when you go back and listen to the 40s, it's just ballads. It's sentimental love songs all over the place. This is the heyday of young Frank Sinatra. Songs are, Tommy Dorsey's theme song was "I'm Getting Sentimental Over You," and
Julie London.
All those
all
the female singers of the era. It's really a golden age of ballads. And so I had an idea to kind of write about that.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, Hating Jazz, A History of Its Disparagement, Mockery, and Other Forms of Abuse is now available. Thank you so much, Andrew, for taking some time to talk about your book.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Today's audio was recorded in the WUSF studio. Production assistance by Adam Darbyshire. Edited by Scott Walkler. I'm Warren Buchholz, host. Studio Sessions is a product of WUSF and is sponsored by Community Foundation Tampa Bay, with support from the Palladium, the Gobia Foundation, and from you. Thank you for your support. Learn more about jazz and arts Access Florida by visiting our website at wusfjazz.org. Copyright 2025, WUSF.